How bad must the situation be in Crimea if some people are now starting to ride in on horseback? It's June 4th, 2026. We are in the 5th year, and this is day 102 since the start of the full-scale invasion. Welcome to the Situation Report. Today's report covers alternative transportation options in Crimea. We will also look at the results of the strike sequence on the naval ship Boyki in the dry dock of St. Petersburg. We will watch footage of the 38th E Brigade as they bring drones far behind the front line. That's what they are going to show us. We will also take a look at exploding field ammunition depots, and above all, the situation in Crimea. And we'll do it in quite some detail. So stay tuned. Of course, I've prepared only the best for you. Yesterday, I told you about the attack on the naval ship Boyki, which was in a dry dock near St. Petersburg. We could only see the drone strike and a thick cloud of smoke over the ship, but not the ship itself. That's why, of course, I brought you the latest satellite images today. Here, you can still see the plumes of smoke quite clearly towards the end of the fire. But hey, you wouldn't be here at War and Tactic if I didn't even get you footage from the scene. Thanks to them is all I can say. One of the masts seems to have been blown away and is hanging down here. Furthermore, two sources of fire can be clearly seen, lying quite close to each other here. I assume these are two drone strikes that hit here. But a Russian blogger will more or less be able to confirm that for us in a moment. Meanwhile, other residents of the city have also woken up and were able to witness the effects of the kinetic sanctions with their own eyes. How do Russian Z bloggers actually assess the situation so far, since what we've had so far has mainly been an assessment from Western sources? Now, especially the well-known Z bloggers are asking an uncomfortable question. How could a modern warship of the Baltic Fleet be hit of all places in a dry dock near St. Petersburg? The Rebus channel openly speaks of yet another proof of Russia's difficulties with drone defense. The corvette was undergoing repairs during the attack and was unable to evade or defend itself. Nevertheless, the Ukrainian drones managed to score at least 2 hits. Even more interesting are the Russian reactions to the actual threat. It is now openly admitted there that the protective measures used so far are not sufficient. Neither air defense nor the now almost infamous nets and metal structures on ships could reliably prevent such attacks. Some Russian military bloggers even assume that Ukraine is using a network of relay drones over the Baltic Sea to control attack drones all the way to the Gulf of Finland. Whether this explanation is true or not, the mere fact that such scenarios are now being seriously discussed shows how great the uncertainty has become. But another point is particularly remarkable. Russian sources are now explicitly warning against hoping that Ukraine will eventually run out of drones. On the contrary, production capacities continue to grow, and the number of attacks increases month by month. And that's probably the real problem for Russia. The Buckley isn't exactly a quick build project. It's a corvette, and it takes years to complete and consume significant resources in the process. Any damage means a long repair time, costs, and above all, another ship that will be out of action for a long time and won't be replaced. So you can tell from the Russian comments that an uncomfortable feeling is slowly developing there. Ukraine is no longer just attacking fuel depots, refineries, and logistics, but is also increasingly targeting the Navy. And even when such strikes happen in St. Petersburg, hundreds of kilometers away from the front, it seems that so far no truly convincing answer has been found. Let's take a look at the south of Ukraine, especially in the occupied area here, around Zaporizhia and Kherson, because by now, so much footage of destroyed Russian vehicles is coming from the E-105 road that I can hardly keep track anymore. Where is the E-105 road located? Let me briefly explain again, especially for the new viewers. Yes, first of all, hello to the new viewers as well, since I usually only greet the regular ones. Here, this is the road of life, a supply route on the Russian side. It leads from Rostov, which is their logistics hub, then goes through Taganrog and then across the border to Mariupol, which is another logistics hub, just like in Melitopol further back. And here in this area, which is marked in yellow up to Crimea from Mariupol to Taganrog, There are drone attacks, but they're not as intense as on the roads marked in red. Yes, exactly, and we'll take a look at the roads marked in red, especially the E105 road, and that's what we're focusing on today. That's this road here, which leads from Melitopol to the north towards the front. By the way, what we're seeing here is the area where the Ukrainians launched their counteroffensive in 2023 and failed. Here at this spot is Robotine, and here are a lot of field fortifications. And here, this road is the one we're talking about now, and you can see pictures of it right now. We're likely seeing just a fraction of what's really happening there. Usually, only the attacks for which there are usable recordings or where civilians film the wrecked vehicles are published. It's almost impossible to estimate how many vehicles are hit beyond that. The E105 road is one of the most important supply routes between Russia, the occupied Crimea, and the areas in between. That's exactly why the road has been under constant pressure from Ukrainian drones for weeks. Tanker trucks, military trucks, transport vehicles, and other logistics targets are regularly attacked there. By now, it seems that driving on these routes has become a kind of lottery for Russian drivers. Hardly a day goes by without new videos of burning vehicles, destroyed tankers, or drone attacks on supply convoys. The scale of this is particularly remarkable. A few weeks ago, people were still talking about individual successful attacks. Today, we're talking about dozens of documented hits along the same supply route. The situation on the roads in the occupied territories has changed drastically within just a few weeks. Anyone traveling there now has to expect at any moment to be spotted and attacked by a Ukrainian drone. The Ukrainians themselves are reporting today another 396 destroyed vehicles along the entire front. However, most of them were probably destroyed here on the supply roads. Something else that was destroyed and is very interesting is a Russian field ammunition depot in the occupied Donetsk region with attack drones. The footage shows a massive secondary explosion, indicating that significant amounts of ammunition were stored there. Such targets are among the most valuable attack targets of all. Every destroyed ammunition bunker, or in this case probably an ammunition pit or an old cattle barn that was designated as an ammunition depot, means fewer Adler artillery shells, fewer rockets, and less resupply for Russian units at the front. While individual destroyed vehicles often only have local effects, but hits on ammunition depots could impact entire sections of the front. Ammunition, therefore, has to be brought in again over greater distances, redistributed, and stored elsewhere. This increases the logistical effort and lengthens the supply routes. That's exactly why the Ukrainians are increasingly relying on such attacks in the rear areas. Every ton of ammunition that explodes in a depot can't be fired at Ukrainian positions later on. The same, of course, applies to the Russians when they destroy a Ukrainian ammunition depot. However, that happens much less frequently. Why does that happen less often? Well, for some reason, the Russians still have the habit of storing ammunition out in the open quite often. How many times have we seen drones flying into piles of ammunition that were stored under trees? Especially mines and explosives are often just thrown into a pit, from which people simply help themselves. I'm not talking about all storage sites here. Yes, quite the opposite. Many Russian storage sites are also well hidden, but often the Russians simply hide their ammunition under bridges, in concrete pipes, or even in cattle sheds, as we saw about a week ago. New footage from the 28th there. Footage from the 28th TH Brigade shows how Ukrainian drones are now operating far behind the actual front line. The target of the attacks is Russian logistics in the Horlivka area. The city is located about 35 to 40 kilometers from the Ukrainian positions. Nevertheless, the Sparrow Spala drones regularly attack vehicles there. They target supply transports and logistics. So for the Russians, the front no longer ends at the actual contact line. The footage of the drone approaches is also interesting. For some targets, the image quality visibly drops just before impact. This means that jammers may still be effective in the final meters, or that the distance to the pilot was really pushed to the limit, or the terrain conditions caused a poor signal. What this shows is that these are not fiber optic drones. The problem for the Russians is that even if the transmission is disrupted, Many drones still reach their target because they simply crash into them. Ukraine is now saying that they have taken fire control over Horlivka. That doesn't mean the city is under military control, but rather that important movements and supply routes there are under constant threat, and that Ukrainian units could theoretically also engage targets in the town. However, this is a Ukrainian statement. I'm fairly certain that Russian drones pose a major threat to Russia. But what makes this attack different from attacks in recent years? Well, Ukraine is no longer just trying to attack directly at the front, but is increasingly shifting its fight to the roads, logistics centers, fuel transports, and supply hubs in the rear areas. Even if targets 40 kilometers behind the front are hit regularly, it will become increasingly difficult for Russia to move personnel, ammunition, and fuel to the front without interference. So instead of fighting every single soldier at the front with a drone, they make sure that the soldiers are not supplied at all. And that's crucial, because without logistics, there can be no attack. And even if there is, it will usually fail miserably. Before we take a look at the situation in Crimea, if you haven't subscribed for free yet, feel free to do so and support the channel. If you want to go further, you can become a channel member. Nowhere else will you find such a concentrated amount of information every day in a concise situation report, except on Saturdays, of course, only thanks to your support. With that, I welcome all new subscribers and channel members. It's great that you're helping to keep the channel running, and thanks to you, there's no need for external advertising within the content. During the night, there was another large wave of attacks in occupied Crimea. Explosions were reported, among other places, in the area of the Air Force bases Belbek and Katra. At the same time, anti-aircraft fire could be heard and seen over Sevastopol, Simferopol, Cape Violet, and Kerch. The reported targets are particularly interesting. Belbek is considered one of the most important Russian military airfields in Crimea and is regularly used by fighter jets. Katra holds military importance and has faced multiple Ukrainian attacks. As has almost become customary, Russia also closed the Kerch Bridge during the attack. The bridge is still considered one of the most important connections between Russia and Crimea, especially now as the land supply route we looked at earlier is increasingly coming under pressure. Over the past night and in recent months, a clear pattern has actually developed. Airfields, air defense, fuel depots, logistics centers, and naval facilities in Crimea are increasingly coming under pressure. The peninsula, which was long considered a secure Russian rear area, is increasingly turning into an active combat zone. Every night, when air defense is active over several cities at the same time and important transport routes are closed, it becomes clear how much the security situation there has changed. However, Ukrainian special forces continue their attacks on Russian naval targets. Now, near Yerkina-Durkin, a Russian patrol ship was hit on the occupied Crimea. The attack was carried out by an FP-2 drone from the first separate center of Ukrainian special forces. The footage shows how the drone directly targets and hits the ship. Even though a patrol ship does not have the same significance as a corvette or a frigate, the attack once again shows a pattern that has become increasingly clear in recent months. Ukraine now regularly attacks Russian naval units directly in their areas of operation, not only in ports or dry docks, but also at sea. What is particularly remarkable here is also the role of the FP-2. In the past, we saw it as a long-range attack drone that simply flew towards some target. Today we see it as a guided medium-range drone, which, equipped with a larger warhead, is mainly used to attack logistics, fuel supplies, infrastructure, and targets deep in the rear area. However, it is also being used more often against ships, coastal sites, and maritime infrastructure. So the peninsula is increasingly developing into an area where practically any military infrastructure can potentially be attacked. And the Ukrainians have mainly achieved this by spending the last few months preparing extensively and attacking many radar systems as well as air defense systems in Crimea. But the targeting of Russian rail logistics in Crimea is also continuing. This time, locomotives in Ladislavika and Rostolny were attacked by drones from the 413th Raid Unit. At first glance, locomotives may not seem particularly spectacular, since Russia has a very large stock of locomotives overall. A few months ago, I did some calculations in the situation report to estimate exactly how many locomotives there are, and how long they could last. Small spoiler, a very long time. However, the situation in Crimea looks a bit different. Every damaged or destroyed locomotive has to be replaced somehow, but replacements can't be brought to the peninsula as quickly as needed. There's also another effect. When a locomotive breaks down, it often doesn't just block itself, but, to put it simply, the entire track as well. Until the vehicle is recovered or removed, traffic on the affected section comes to a standstill. And in Crimea, that's very critical because there aren't many alternative routes. A railway worker from the community once wrote in the comments that this can actually be done pretty quickly if you just tow the tank cars away with another locomotive and then simply push the burning engine off the track. So if the track really needs to be cleared quickly, but I think that won't always be the case here. Especially in Crimea with its relatively few main connections, this can quickly lead to significant delays. But let's stay in Crimea for a moment because we're not done yet. The fuel crisis here is continuing to escalate. Before I go into more detail, I have to show you this man first. He repeats exactly what I said yesterday. And I think that's great because I said it from my own personal perspective, but he says it from the perspective of a Russian resident in Crimea. Because he also gets upset with tourists who go to Crimea for vacation and then wonder why there's no electricity, water, or fuel. And then things like, hey, this isn't working. We can't even go swimming or leave the island because we don't have any more gas. He then says, don't they have anything better to do? And are they even aware that there's no fuel here? That's what he asks them. Or that maybe they should think about where they've actually gone, because that should already be common knowledge. Meanwhile, kilometer-long lines are forming at gas stations. In many places, there are arguments over the last available amounts of fuel. Especially at gas stations, there are occasional disputes between civilians. Even where gasoline and diesel are still available, it doesn't automatically mean you can still fill up. According to reports, the vouchers that are handed out are often not enough, or the stations have already reached their daily quotas, or they are simply empty. This also makes the logistical crisis on the peninsula increasingly clear. What just a few weeks ago seemed like an isolated supply problem now affects entire regions of Crimea. Long waiting lines, rationing, and uncertainty about the next delivery are now part of everyday life. But the fuel problems are no longer limited to Crimea. Now, 14 other Russian regions are also reporting restrictions on fuel sales. In the Kursk, Belgorod, and Pskov regions, customers are only allowed to purchase 20 liters of fuel per vehicle at some gas stations. Similar reports are now also coming from Moscow, the Moscow region, and St. Petersburg, interestingly enough. Elsewhere, the measures are becoming even more absurd. In Krasnoyarsk and the Tomsk region, fuel is sometimes no longer being sold in canisters. In Voronezh, drivers are reporting empty fuel pumps, while in the Lufgorod regions, limits of 20 liters per vehicle are also being introduced. This development is particularly interesting because Moscow only recently assured that the problems were limited to local areas. Meanwhile, reports are now emerging from the European part of Russia, from Siberia, and even from the northern regions at the same time. By the way, the Russians are still blaming the whole situation on poorly coordinated repair work within the Russian regions. That means there are no attacks from Ukraine, and there is also no air defense that can't handle these attacks. No, it's simply because they poorly coordinated the repair and maintenance of more refineries. You really can't make this up. So that also fits with the developments of the last few weeks. Refineries have actually been attacked, oil infrastructure sites have been hit, tank farms have been damaged, and important logistics routes are currently under pressure. Russia still has enormous oil reserves, so they're not at their limit and they're definitely not running out. But what's crucial is not the oil that's somewhere in the ground, but the ability to turn it into fuel and transport it to where it's needed. And it's exactly at these points where problems are piling up right now. With that, I'd like to thank all the old and new subscribers, channel members, and the Algo crew. Special thanks to Lieutenant Colonel Renica, Celia, Dietrich, Freddie, and Meyerhofer. Please subscribe, like, comment, and see you at the next report.